Hello again. Today, the expression concentration camp evokes the horrors of Nazi Germany, conjuring up black and white images of Auschwitz and Belsen. But Germans were neither the first nation to make use of concentration camps, nor the last. Before going any further, we're not talking about death camps here, but concentration camps. These are simply places where people are held not for anything they've actually done, but for rather who they are, their religion, political beliefs, ethnicity, nationality, and so on. The British have been early adopters of these exceedingly useful establishments. During the Second World War, between 1899 and 1902, they set up a network of camps in which conditions were so ghastly that over 22,000 children under the age of 16 died of starvation and disease. That, of course, was in South Africa, but concentration camps were found really useful in Britain itself, actually on the mainland, British Isles, for much of the 20th century. During World War One, the United Kingdom used concentration camps to control those they could not or would not bring before the courts, men who had committed no offence besides belonging to the wrong nationality or ethnic group. Among these were Germans and Austrians living in Britain, as well as Irish citizens suspected of disloyalty to the Crown. A century ago, no one hesitated to call concentration camps by their correct name. On December the 4th, 1914, for example, the Manchester Guardian, which we now know today as The Guardian, carried the headline "Disorder at Lancaster Concentration Camp." The article described a bayonet charge by troops to restore order among the German civilians detained in the camp. In London, there was a concentration camp at Stratford in East London, and also the Alexandra Palace concentration camp, which held thousands of prisoners. Conditions in both camps were pretty grim. Later, the authorities opened a concentration camp in a remote part of Wales to cope with the thousands of Irish political prisoners who had been filling up British prisons. Frongoch concentration camp, built around a disused factory, established a pattern for the camps that began to appear all over Europe in the 1930s. A barbed wire fence circled the old buildings and wooden huts were constructed to increase the camp's capacity. Eventually, Frongoch held over 2,000 Irish Republicans. On March 22nd, 1933, the first concentration camp in Nazi Germany opened near the Bavarian town of Dachau. Like Frongoch, it consisted of a barbed wire fence around an old factory with wooden huts to house more prisoners. Dachau's example inspired the autocratic ruler of another country. Poland's ageing Marshal Piłsudski was, like Hitler, having problems with citizens who opposed his view. A lot of them were also communists. A little over a year after Dachau opened, his regime set up a camp for those whose activities or conduct gave rise to the belief that they threatened the public security, peace or order. Like Dachau, the Bereza Katuszka concentration camp followed the British model, a disused building surrounded by barbed wire. British politicians hold habeas corpus, the right not to be imprisoned without trial, in sentimental regard, claiming it as one of the United Kingdom's core values. Sometimes when people talk about British values, which are supposed to be taught in schools these days, they mention habeas corpus. Their attachment to this notion is really just rhetoric, because whenever habeas corpus threatens to interfere with good governance, it's promptly dropped. The United Kingdom will ditch habeas corpus with positively indecent haste when they feel it's necessary. The history of British concentration camps in the 1940s, when the government not only imprisoned refugees and German soldiers, but also gave a foreign government the right to organise camps on the British Isles, highlights this fundamental hypocrisy. In June 1940, with a German invasion expected at any moment, Prime Minister Winston Churchill decided to arrest every German and Austrian in the country and send them all to concentration camps. To those who reminded him that many of these people were Jewish refugees, he responded briefly and memorably, "Collar the lot." Of course, no one wanted to call these new institutions concentration camps, so they renamed them internment camps to differentiate them from the Nazis' practice. But these camps also held people indefinitely and without trial because of their nationality, ethnicity, religion or political beliefs. While the British camps do not begin to compare to those in Nazi Germany, they were indisputably concentration camps. Whatever their name, the government built them to keep those the state could not permit to remain at large behind barbed wire. These new camps resembled Frauengoch, Dachau and Beretzer Katuschka. The military commandeered rows of houses and built barbed wire fences round them. In addition to German nationals, the vast majority of whom were Jews who had fled their homes to avoid a similar fate, the government arrested and held 1,000 British citizens. These prisoners included a retired admiral, a member of parliament, and a former general secretary of the Women's Social and Political Union, otherwise known as the suffragettes. That same year, the British government allowed another country to build and run concentration camps in Scotland. After the fall of France in 1940, over 20,000 Polish soldiers were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk to Britain. The United Kingdom and Poland agreed they would be dispatched to Scotland, charged with protecting the east coast of that country from the German forces who had just invaded Norway. In return, the Polish government in exile, led by General Sikorski, was allowed to conduct their own affairs as they saw fit. The British government treated these bases in Scotland as sovereign Polish territory. General Sikorski feared that other exiled Polish politicians were plotting against him, so he opened a camp at Rothesay on the Isle of Bute, just 30 miles from Glasgow, for those he worried would threaten his authority. He made no secret of his intentions, explaining at a meeting of the Polish National Council in London on July the 18th, 1940, "There is no Polish judiciary. Those who conspire will be sent to a concentration camp." Eventually, Sikorski set up half a dozen camps. Some held political prisoners, including Marian Zindram-Koszalski, former Polish Prime Minister, and General Ludmil Antoni Rejski, former commander of the Polish Air Force. Others were reserved for persons of improper moral character, including homosexuals. A large number of detainees were Jews. The Rothesay camp was relatively easy-going, intended only to prevent discontented army officers and politicians from working against Sikorski's interests. While at Rothesay, these dissidents could not be in London attempting to challenge the general's authority. As the number of camps increased, the newer ones started to look more like the traditional version, with barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and brutal guards prepared to shoot prisoners out of hand. Prisoners in camps such as those at Tyne Bruach, Kingledores and Inverkeithing were certainly mistreated and occasionally murdered. On October 29, 1940, for example, a Jewish prisoner named Edward Jakubowski was shot dead at the camp near Kingledores. Courts later ruled that the guard who killed him, Marian Przybysky, was using his weapon in the execution of his duties. The British police did not investigate these deaths because the Polish army had complete and unlimited authority over their own citizens in Britain. As the war continued, some members of Parliament became uneasy about the Scottish camps and began asking questions about individual cases, which invariably involved Jewish prisoners. In 1941, Samuel Silverman, the MP for Nelson and Colne, inquired about Benjamin and Jack Asgenberg, two Jewish brothers who had been arrested by Polish soldiers in London and transported to Scotland. Silverman asked the Secretary of State for War, how many persons are now detained by the Polish authorities in this country under their powers under the Allied Forces Act? He received a vague reply. The British government could not afford to alienate their ally at such an important time. Unease about Polish camps reached a climax in 1945. On June 15th, just weeks before the end, after the end of the war in Europe, the Russian newspaper Pravda carried an article that began, "The Polish fascist concentration camp system, notorious before the Germans started Buchenwald and other camps, was preserved when the Poles fled from Poland." An account of the abduction of Dr. Jan Jagodzinski, a Jewish academic, followed. He had been spirited off to Scotland and held in the Inverkeithing concentration camp, just a few miles north of Edinburgh. To alleviate fears, the Polish government in exile allowed the press to visit the camp. It quickly regretted this decision. The first prisoner the writer spoke to was another Jew, and the journalist learned that a prisoner had been shot dead by one of the guards the previous week. After World War II ended, the newly elected Labour government put pressure on the Polish authorities to close down their camps, but they stayed open as late as 1946. By that time, the British themselves had begun employing slave labour on an industrial scale, using hundreds of camps across the country to imprison workers. The end of the war precipitated an agricultural crisis in the United Kingdom. As part of the government's policy to achieve food self-sufficiency, it dedicated twice as much land to growing wheat in 1945 as in 1938. During the war, the Women's Land Army and school children donated their time to farming. After peace, it was unlikely they would continue to engage in back-breaking labour for free. Without an unpaid workforce, the country could not maintain its agricultural output. In 1945, Britain held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners at home, as well as in Canada, the United States and North Africa. In order to use them as slave labour, however, the government would have to strip them of the protections offered to them by the Geneva Convention, which, of course, Britain had signed. So the United Kingdom changed the prisoner status from prisoners of war to surrendered enemy personnel. Prisoners of war must be housed and fed at least as well as their captors' own armed forces. With many thousands of prisoners working the land, this wasn't possible. During the harsh winter of 1945, the men transported to Britain only had tents for shelter, which would have breached international law had they been recognised as prisoners of war. In the first post-war year, the United Kingdom brought a staggering number of men from all over the world to work the land. In May 1946, 3,000 men a week were arriving in Britain and being sent off to the army-guarded camps. The Geneva Convention also requires prisoners of war to be repatriated as soon as hostilities ceased, but it took the United Kingdom until 1948 to allow the last of the enslaved Germans to return to their own country. Between 1945 and 1948, the Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi officers for crimes against humanity, including, of course, compulsory uncompensated labour. In 1947, the SS officers who administered the Third Reich's slave system were tried, and a number of the defendants were subsequently hanged for their wartime activities. Judge Robert Tom said, "There is no such thing as benevolent slavery. Involuntary servitude, even tempered by humane treatment, is still slavery." At the time of this judgment, over 300,000 enslaved workers were bringing in the British harvest. This short video cannot further explore British concentration camps in the years between 1940 and 1948, which would include a longer discussion of the United Kingdom's decision to keep some German camps open. The Belsen concentration camp, renamed Hone, held Jews who wished to emigrate to Palestine in defiance of British wishes. The British even built 2 new camps after the end of the war near the German town of Lübeck. In 1947, Amsterdam and Poppendorf were crammed with Jews the British didn't want to let leave Europe. The British have always held hypocritical positions when it comes to concentration camps. They are as eager as any other nation to use them, while always being the first to condemn any country that sets up similar establishments. I hope that this has been an interesting talk. This isn't a full list of the concentration camps operated by the British in the 20th century. Really, I've just been talking about those that were run on the British mainland itself. Perhaps in another talk I'll mention places like the ones in Cyprus and so on.